Napoleon made one small mistake at the Battle of Waterloo that had huge consequences. On June 1815, French Emperor Napoleon I was defeated by a coalition of European powers led by the United Kingdom and the Netherlands at the Battle of Waterloo in present-day Belgium. The battle, which took place just over a month after Napoleon's return from exile on the island of Elba, marked the end of his rule over France and his final defeat, which led to his first and only abdication and the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty under King Louis XVIII. But before we get into it, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. And if you enjoy the content, consider supporting us. The battle took place near the village of Waterloo in present-day Belgium, which at the time was part of the Low Countries. The battle was part of the larger war that followed Napoleon's return from exile in 1815. When Napoleon returned to France, he quickly raised an army and began a campaign to conquer Europe. On June 18th, Napoleon woke up feeling unwell. His stomach was in bad shape, and he suffered from bouts of dizziness. Normally, Napoleon would take a small dose of something called laudanum to settle his stomach. He understood the importance of being alert and focused when leading his troops into battle. Typically, he was a very decisive and quick-thinking leader, able to assess a situation and make decisions quickly. However, on June, his normally sharp mind was clouded by pain and discomfort, which slowed his decision-making process. In short, he was not himself. It would be an understatement to say that Napoleon was a strict disciplinarian. Napoleon was typically very thorough in his planning, but on June, he seemed to be distracted and unable to focus on the task at hand. At the start of the battle, Napoleon ordered a series of attacks that initially caught the Allies by surprise. As the battle raged, Napoleon gave conflicting orders and his troops were unsure of what to do. This lack of communication allowed the Allies to gain the upper hand and ultimately defeat the French army. However, as the day wore on, the French attacks became increasingly disorganized and ineffective. But at the heart of it all was his failure to properly prepare his troops. This can be traced back to his deteriorating physical condition, which led to a lapse in his normally brilliant judgment. His illness and the refusal of his valet to give him laudanum affected his sleep, his mental acuity, and his ability to make sound decisions. Ultimately, it led to a tragic end for Napoleon and his army. Part of the reason for this was the lack of proper preparation. Let us know in the comments. And while you're down there, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an upload. And if you enjoy the content, consider supporting us. Your support helps us continue producing these videos for you. Napoleon's troops were not familiar with the terrain, and he had not taken the time to brief them on the specifics of the battle plan. This led to confusion and hesitation among the troops, which gave the Allies time to regroup and launch a counterattack. He failed to properly brief his troops on the battle plan, and as a result, there was confusion and miscommunication among his ranks. This led to a breakdown in discipline and ultimately contributed to the French army's defeat. He expected his soldiers to follow his orders to the letter and was known to mete out harsh punishments to those who disobeyed him. However, on June, he seemed less concerned with military strategy and more interested in punishing those around him. This created a climate of fear and resentment among his troops, which likely affected their morale and overall performance in battle. This was another departure from his usual behavior, and it would ultimately have a significant impact on the battle. But on June, he had not slept much the night before due to the aforementioned stomach ailment. This lack of sleep, coupled with his deteriorating physical condition, led to a decline in his mental acuity. This was noticeable to those around him, with some of his staff expressing concern over his well-being. Laudanum was an opium-based tincture used as a painkiller and sedative. However, his valet and attendant, aware that Napoleon had taken laudanum the night before and not wanting him to become addicted to the drug, refused to give it to him. He was quick to anger and lashed out at his staff and generals, berating them for perceived or real mistakes. This created a tense atmosphere around him and made it difficult for anyone to approach him with new ideas or strategies. Typically, Napoleon was open to suggestions from his generals and staff, but on June, he was not. Napoleon, who had no idea that his valet had withheld the medicine, grew increasingly frustrated as the day wore on, and his stomach continued to feel like a bucket of rusty nails. This led to a change in behavior that would have far-reaching consequences. He tried to shake off these ailments, but they persisted throughout the day. By the time he got around to eating lunch, he was feeling worse for wear. He ate some soup and bread, but this didn't help much. And by 6 p.m., when he was preparing for the upcoming battle, he was still feeling nauseous. He won several battles against the coalition forces, including the battles of Ligny and Carencerbes. However, at the Battle of Quatre Bras, he was held off by a British force under the command of the Duke of Wellington. Your support helps us continue producing these videos for you. Despite being outnumbered, the British and their allies were able to hold their ground and eventually drove back Napoleon's forces. Napoleon's army was defeated and he was forced to flee the battlefield. He eventually surrendered to the British and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he died in 1821. It also marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which had been raging across Europe for more than a decade. Before we go any further, let us take a quick look at the state of Napoleon's health at the time of the battle. This is important because it will play a big role in what we're going to talk about. Prior to the battle, Napoleon had secured a number of victories against the coalition forces, including the battles of Ligny and Carencerbes, which were fought on the same day as Waterloo. But despite his military successes, Napoleon ultimately lost the battle and was forced into exile once again. So why did Napoleon lose at Waterloo? We can point to a few reasons, but there is one that stands out above all the others. In this episode, we explore what that one fatal flaw was that led to Napoleon's final defeat. So, as we said, the Battle of Waterloo was fought between Napoleon's French army and a coalition force of British, Dutch, German, and other troops. On the day of the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's forces engaged the British and their allies in a series of attacks that ultimately failed to achieve a decisive victory. While there are many factors that contributed to Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, in this episode, we will focus on just one. In short, Napoleon was sick, not gravely, but enough to the point where it would affect his decision-making during the battle. Now, this is where things could have gone differently. First, it should be noted that Napoleon was typically well-rested prior to a battle. But beyond just being tired, Napoleon's stomach issues were affecting him in other ways. One of the most notable changes in Napoleon's behavior was his increased irritability. The combination of lack of sleep, physical discomfort, and a general feeling of malaise led to a change in Napoleon's demeanor that was palpable to those around him. This brings us to the one thing that Napoleon did wrong on the day of the battle. It was his failure to properly prepare his troops. To understand how this played out, it helps to know a bit more about the battle itself. Furthermore, Napoleon's failure to properly prepare his troops led to a breakdown in communication. So in the end, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo can be attributed to a variety of factors. What do you think? Do you agree that Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo can be attributed to his declining health and the breakdown in his decision-making process? Thanks for watching.